So, you've probably heard the name Marcus Garvey, right? Most likely connected to the Back to Africa movement. But here's the thing. He was so much more than just a figure in a history book. He was a political philosopher with a really radical and, for some, a prophetic view of the world. So today, we're not going to do the standard history lesson. We're diving straight into his core ideas, using his own words to get inside his philosophy of power. And it all kicks off with one single, uncompromising belief.
There it is. A race without authority and power is a race without respect. For Garvey, looking at the world in the early 20th century, it was that simple. Brutally simple. You see, he believed respect wasn't something you were given, it was something you commanded. And the way you commanded it wasn't through goodwill or by appealing to people's morality. Nope, it was through raw, organized power. And that one idea, well, it's the engine that drives everything we're going to talk about.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First up, the man and his mission. Then, we'll unpack his diagnosis of oppression. After that, we'll dig into his call for power, explore his ultimate vision, and the serious warning that came with it. And we'll end on the fundamental question his whole philosophy leaves us with today. Okay, so let's jump right in. Section 1, a man and his mission. Because to really get Garvey's philosophy, you have to understand the world that made him. I mean, these ideas didn't just appear out of thin air. They were a direct response to a very, very specific moment in history. I want you to imagine the world in the decades right after slavery ended. Emancipation happens, but for a whole generation of black people, being free on paper didn't mean they were actually free in reality. They were still caught in a web of segregation and economic dependence. It was a world of broken promises. And it's right in the middle of this that Garvey starts the UNIA in 1914. The ideas that he would later put in his philosophy and opinions, they were a direct reaction to the feeling that emancipation just hadn't delivered real freedom. So that brings us to Section 2, the diagnosis of oppression. What exactly did Garvey think the root of the problem was? He took a hard look at the condition of black people all over the world, and he came back with a diagnosis that was, well, it was sharp, and it did not pull any punches.
And this is where it gets really telling. Garvey's first target wasn't an external enemy. It was an internal weakness. He argued that the biggest problem, the thing that let all other forms of oppression happen, was a lack of unity, a lack of strategy, a lack of disciplined organization. His message was basically, before you can even think about fighting anybody else, you have to get your own house in order.
And he was not shy about who he blamed. He pointed right at a group of leaders he called traitors. In his view, these were people often well-educated who cared more about getting praise and funding from outside groups than they did about fighting for their own people. He felt they were teaching everyone else to be quiet and meek just to keep the peace and the money flowing. To Garvey, they weren't leaders of liberation. They were just managers of a broken system.
Now, beyond the internal problems, Garvey saw a very deliberate external system of control. He broke it down into 4 parts. First, you use propaganda to crush people's confidence. Second, you enforce economic dependence, so they're always living at someone else's mercy. Third, you use the political system with laws designed to exclude them. And the final piece of the trap, the lack of nationhood. No government of their own to stand up for them on the world stage. It was a complete system.
Okay, on to Section 3, the call for power. See, Garvey wasn't just a critic. For every single problem he pointed out, he had a concrete solution. And his entire plan was about building power through self-reliance and direct action. 400 million. Garvey hammered this number home again and again and again. Why? He wanted to completely shatter the mindset of being a scattered minority and replace it with the consciousness of being a massive global people. 400 million wasn't a number to be pitied, it was a sleeping giant. And he argued that if that giant ever woke up and got organized, it would be a source of almost unimaginable power.
So, what did he really mean by power? This is super important. For Garvey, it wasn't about violence. It was way more fundamental. It was the simple, real-world ability to act in your own best interest, without needing to ask for permission. He thought trying to appeal to other people's conscience was basically a waste of breath. As he put it, power is the only argument that satisfies man. It's the only thing that actually compels others to respect you. And Garvey had this clear 3-part blueprint for building that power. First, you had to start with financial and industrial power.
That means building your own businesses, creating your own jobs, achieving self-sufficiency. Then, you use that wealth to build the second pillar, scientific and educational power, creating your own institutions, mastering technology, and once you have those two, you've built the foundation for the ultimate goal, political and governmental power, a sovereign nation that can protect its people anywhere in the world.
At its heart, this whole call for power was really a call for a deep psychological change. Garvey demanded a total shift in mindset, from what he called the old cringing weakling, a mentality he believed came from centuries of oppression, to the mindset of full-grown men demanding our portion as men. The message was clear. The time for begging is over. The time for waiting for handouts is over. It's time to stand up and demand your fair share of the world.
And that's really the key. Before any of the big stuff, the industries, the governments could happen, the change had to start inside the individual. Garvey was certain that the first battle for power was the battle for your own mind. Just look at this quote. If you have no confidence in self, you are twice defeated. With confidence, you have won even before you have started. For him, confidence wasn't just a nice feeling. It was the first victory you absolutely had to win.
And all of this leads us to Section 4, Garvey's grand vision and his dire warning. What was the whole point of all this organizing and power building? Well, the goal was huge, and the stakes were even higher. This was the guiding star of the entire movement. Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad. This slogan summed up his ultimate goal perfectly. It was about redeeming the ancestral motherland from colonial rule and establishing a modern, powerful black nation that could act as a protector for the entire race, no matter where they lived.
And let's be really clear. Garvey's vision was not some romantic fantasy about returning to a primitive past. Not at all. Listen to his own words. He saw a modern, developed Africa with dotted cities and a beautiful civilization. His goal wasn't to escape the modern world. It was to build a black-led version of it. A nation that could compete on its own terms in science, industry, and culture.
In Garvey's mind, the stakes could not have been higher. He saw only two possible futures. Path 1, organize, build power, and create that strong nation in Africa. The alternative, if the race stayed disorganized and dependent, was what he called the tragedy of race extinction. He bluntly argued that in the cold calculus of history, weaker peoples are always eventually pushed aside or eliminated by stronger, more organized groups.
And for Garvey, this wasn't just a wild theory. He saw it as a historical pattern. He'd point to groups like the ancient Britons. When they were enslaved by the Romans, they didn't earn respect by trying to fit in Rome. No, they earned it by going back to their own land, Britain, and building their own power, their own civilization. He argued the path to sovereignty was always the same. Go to your native land, develop power, and build a government. For the Negro, he argued, that path led to Africa.
And so that brings us to our final section. Garvey's philosophy, born in a world over a century ago, leaves us with a really powerful and frankly uncomfortable question that still hangs in the air today. If you strip away all the historical details, this is the core of Garvey's challenge to all of us. He forces us to ask, in a world that, then and now, often runs on group interests, can any people truly guarantee their future just by appealing to ideals like justice and morality? Or is a unified, collective power base, economic, political, cultural, the only realistic insurance policy for survival and for dignity? It's a heavy question, and it's one that Garvey believed every group and every single individual has to answer for themselves.